So here's what I want you to see today. We have covered so much. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to go all the way back to the beginning and let's just kind of recap and then we're done. You ready? Take a deep breath for me. All right, so we have covered so much today. So we started today. I was telling you about the 5 levels of learning. What you saw me do today is we didn't just focus on knowing the what, right? What is it or what do the protocols say? We really went into the how and the why. And then I showed you how do we apply this information, right? Okay. So we started off talking about glucose and then how we're going to eventually get us some ATP. But however, in a chronic disease, you're running out of ATP. So, for instance, I went through the whole thing about cellular inflammation. You don't have enough ATP to power up the cells. The ATPase doesn't work. The sodium gets trapped in, the chloride or chlorine gets trapped in. That creates salt. And then they attract water and it causes the cell to swell and swell and swell. We call that inflammation. But I said we also don't have enough ATP to power up the bone marrow. So the bone marrow can't make white blood cells. And now we have leukopenia. If we don't make red blood cells, now we have anemia. If we don't make platelets, now we got thrombocytopenia, right? We talked about if you centrifuge blood, for instance, we have the plasma, the buffy coat, the red blood cells that settle to the bottom. In fact, we check for an erythrocyte sedimentation rate. That's a measure of, for instance, how much. That's one marker of inflammation. It doesn't necessarily tell you what the problem is, but it just tells you that there is some inflammation. So we went over anemia, leukopenia, thrombocytopenia. I talked about the different types of red blood cells, how long they live, how long it takes to make them. We also talked about what are the lab values of red blood cells. We went over the different categories of anemia, whether we're talking about microcytic, normalcytic, or macrocytic anemia. So we went heavy into red blood cells. We talked about conditions like hereditary spherocytosis, where you're missing the spectrin and ankyrin. We talked about sickle cell. Then we talked about the normal hemoglobin, for instance, the alpha and the beta chains that make up the normal hemoglobin, and then the alpha and gamma chains that make up fetal hemoglobin. We talked about white blood cells. Remember, we're going to use never let mom eat beans to figure out our types of white blood cells. Neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. The neutrophils deal with bacterial infections. If you don't make enough of them, now you're going to be prone to bacterial infections. They also deal with acute inflammation. We said that neutrophils show up in around 4.5 hours. That's how we explain things like why you have less than that to treat a stroke, for instance, because you don't want those neutrophils to come and release those free radicals, for instance, cause that free radical damage. We talked about lymphocytes, those B cells, T cells, natural killer cells. We talked about how those plasma and memory B cells produce the different antibodies, IgG, IgA, IgM, IgE, IgD, right? We said the monocytes, they're called monocytes when they're in the bloodstream, but when they go to the tissues, they become either macrophages or dendritic cells. And depending on the type of tissue, these macrophages have different names. Okay? We talked about eosinophils. If you don't make them, now you're going to be more prone to, for instance, parasitic infections and also allergic reactions. Um, and then basophils, there again it deals with certain allergic reactions. We talked about platelets, for instance. What happens if so let me just yeah, so I talked about how the red blood cells are made. Let's see, talked about how the red blood cells are made, the different cell types. We talked about all the lab values. We went all through anemia. Talked all about the white blood cells. Man, we have covered so much. Oh yeah, we talked about granulomas, for instance. So what I want you to do is just go back and watch this video a few times to make sure you get all the story. And then we talked about the actions of steroids. We also finished with platelets and all the places that if you don't make enough platelets, for instance, either you don't make them or you use them up or they're hiding out. But either way, it can cause thrombocytopenia. And we went into the different situations that cause it, for instance. And yeah, So, guys, this this has been a lot. We covered so much about the blood today. So, I hope this has been helpful. I hope you learned a lot. And if you have any questions, feel free to place your questions in the comments. I will get back to you guys as quickly as I can. And that is it for today. So, everybody, have a great night. See you soon.